Up to now, we've been talking about axial coding and really trying to keep things at the lowest level of abstraction. I'm sorry, we've been talking about open coding and keeping things at the really the lowest level of abstraction. And now what we're trying to do is move up a level of abstraction. Another difference is that with axial coding, we are trying to integrate different codes that might have been developed during open coding. And this is also where we start paying attention to our research questions and using the focus of our preliminary research questions to really guide where we focus our analysis, which and which moves we make analytically, which open codes get dropped, which open codes get kept, how we try to group codes and give them some hierarchy, and so forth. So let's talk about this next phase, which is really about integrating or axial coding. So when you've broken down everything down into so many little parts, then in axial coding, what you're trying to do is take a look at all of these zillions of open codes that you have developed, and you're trying to group them in particular ways. And gradually, through a process of grouping and constant comparing and regrouping, you are trying to create subcategories. So, not just one level of categories, but you're beginning to arrange categories hierarchically, where there are higher order codes and lower order codes. And you're also really dropping a lot of the open codes that you may have developed during the first phase. So because you have more of a focus on your research questions, um, you are really just kind of focusing on what are the things that most obviously connect with my research questions, and how do I want to begin creating some dimensionality to these data. In other words, um, do, are we trying to identify the nature of a phenomenon? What are its basic properties? What are its basic features? And using codes that map onto those kinds of categories and arranging them in higher order and lower order structure. We're trying to add dimension to our data as well, potentially. If I have a range of categories that explain something, do we want to map those categories along a dimension, for example? So let's say I'm looking at how newcomers to organizations uh, deal with the uncertainty that they are experiencing in their work. If I had been doing that with qualitative data 30 years ago, what I might have found is that people use information seeking strategies that are more overt and obvious, and are more covert and less obvious. Um, Strategies that respond to a concern about social costs, a concern about social costs of seeking information being high versus social costs of seeking information being low. Now, I just used some theoretical terminology there because those are some existing theoretical frameworks that we have. But when we do inductive research on newcomers and information seeking, we tend to find inductively the same things. And so the point is that this, I'm just trying to provide you with an example of dimensionality. I might say, oh, there's all these different strategies that these people are using to manage this uncertainty. Well, can I arrange those strategies on a continuum that ranges from X to Y, overt to covert, low social costs to high social costs? Are there, lots of uncertainty here. Are there different types of uncertainty? Can I develop a typology of the types of uncertainty that newcomers are experiencing? And what are the properties of these different types of uncertainty? And do these types of uncertainty, are they just different types? Or do they exist on some kind of dimension that ranges from X to Y? That sort of thing. The other purpose of axial coding is to identify relationships between codes. Are these, does are you saying that this thing leads to this other thing in a process? Are you saying that this directly causes the other thing in a more or less traditional cause effect stimulus response kind of way? Are you saying that these categories enable something to happen later? Do they constrain something that can happen later? If you take a closer look at reading things by Strauss and Corbin, for example, on axial coding, you'll see a lot of different kinds of terms that can be used to kind of dig into all the different ways that we could think of arranging categories and giving them dimension. So are we talking about different types of actions, different types of interactions? Are we talking about consequences? Are we talking about enabling conditions? You're trying to figure out, are there ways that we can connect these categories and further refine our understanding of the properties of these categories in ways that give the data some dimension? So we're not just talking about a bunch of categories that exist at the same level of abstraction. Now we may have first order categories, second order levels of explanation, and so forth. So with first order data, here we're talking about codes that are more like in vivo codes. They originate at the level of the language that the informants are using, the people that you're studying, the people that are talking in the interviews, the people that you're observing, the people that generated these documents. And you are coding these things with a really low level of abstraction that's basically at the same level of meaning of the people that are speaking in that text. So it would need to be a category that is defined in a way that would easily make sense to the people who generated these texts or whose behavior was being observed, if we were talking about expanded field nodes. Um, and then there's second order data. And this is a higher level of abstraction. This is the level of abstraction that we were trying to avoid in open coding. Now we're talking about a higher order of abstraction, a higher level of abstraction, but that is grounded in the data itself. Or we're still, as much as possible, kind of reluctant to go ahead and use existing terminology, especially early on in the axial coding process. Eventually, later on, we may eventually conclude that, hey, this there is this existing category or existing label or theory or concept or dimension that comes from existing research that we want to go ahead and use to categorize our data. But that only makes sense to do so if what the patterns that we're identifying in the data, just in the data themselves, not in the assumptions that we're imposing on the data, if the patterns that we're identifying already fit existing research. And so that means that another thing that you're doing in axial coding is you are really trying to look for patterns. If you find yourself tempted to apply second order codes that map on to theoretical concepts, you really need to first thoroughly search your data for categories that don't fit that existing scheme, that don't fit that existing framework, that don't fit that existing perspective. It's not just that you want to avoid finding what you're looking for; you actually want to look for what you're not hoping to find. In terms of things like negative case analysis. So if I think I'm finding a pattern in this data where this category often leads to this category in a, let's say, sort of a cause effect kind of way or an enabling condition kind of way, I want to actually be looking into my data for cases that defy that pattern. I want to be looking for examples that don't fit this existing pattern that I think I'm finding. That's part of constant comparative analysis as well. And so when you get to the place where you're assigning second order data codes, then you need to be constructing theoretical memos that help you, really document, where am I getting this idea from my data that this leads to that this constrains that. that this is action and that is structure, or whatever. I need to write theoretical memos that really connect the dots logically about every little inference that I'm making. And so this is the idea of having what's called an audit trail. Just as you might have your taxes audited, people want to, the IRS wants to go back and look at, why was this classified as tax deductible? What was that expense? What was that purchase used for, et cetera, et cetera. Similarly, in constant comparative analysis, you need to be able to document all of these little analytic choices that you made. Why did you conclude that this was not just an enabling condition, but a direct cause of some particular outcome? Not just that it made it more likely or a more greater possibility, but that this is more of a direct cause in a traditional stimulus response sense of things. So theoretical memos become very important in axial coding as well. So here we're thinking about, there's often kind of an implicit meta-theoretical paradigm that comes in here. And these aren't theories, these are meta theories. For example, social exchange theory is a meta theory. The idea that we want to minimize costs and maximize rewards. That's an implicit framework that may end up creeping into some of your axial coding here. As long as it's a meta theoretical framework that's really broad, that may make sense to do. The difference between individual actions and interactions, actions that are taken in response to someone else's actions, causes and consequences, enabling structures and constraining structures. Um, if you are interested in the meta theory of structuration, you may be sort of guided to be looking for categories that help you develop an explanatory framework that doesn't just explain structure and how structure shapes things in a top-down way, but also how the social actions that we take also influence outcomes in kind of a bottom-up way. And so balancing structure and process, or structure and action as explanatory factors, might be a thing that you're trying to do. Remember, one thing that just about everybody agrees on, at least in the abstract, is the idea that there is no such thing as a theoretical observation. So as much as we're trying to bracket off theory, we can never do it completely. And frankly, when we have to start doing that in the axial coding process, it's better for us to do that in a way that is more mindful and open and documented. And should be documented in field notes, because it's always possible that some reviewer at a journal, for example, will want to know, well, how did you get to that place in your analysis where you concluded that X was causing Y, or X was leading to Y, or X was an enabling condition for Y, or this structure is being drawn upon by these actions, and these actions are reflecting and reproducing this structure. Well, how did you conclude that? Where did you get there? That's what theoretical memos are. And these are just basically notes that you're writing to yourself about what patterns you're seeing in your data, why you're drawing this inference that these categories are related in this particular way. Make sure and document that, because it can be frustrating later on in the process when some professor, some reviewer wants to know, well, how did you get there? I don't understand this. You need to be able to explain that. And that's what theoretical memos are for. We can think about motives, goals, barriers, outcomes. Think about those as higher order categories under which some of these lower order categories that used to be open codes could fit. Some of these lower order categories might also be, you might have broken things down into 5 different open codes that they can all be collapsed into one open code. And then that one open code can be combined with these other open codes, and this set of open codes, these are motives, and this set of open codes over here, these are goals, and this set of open codes over here are barriers. This set of open codes over here, these are examples of outcomes. Constantly rolling through these codes and combining ones that don't make sense to separate anymore, dropping ones that are identified in the data at such a low level of frequency that they're probably not relevant to your analysis. Causal conditions, intervening conditions, contextual conditions. So you may find that there is a certain causal pattern, but remember that qualitative research is really about getting into context. That's one of the main potential benefits of qualitative research. And what you may discover is that there's not a stable causal pattern that is true all of the time, but that this causal pattern tends to be the case in this context and in this context, but not in this other context. So there may be particular contexts or conditions in which different types of um, relationships between categories hold to be true, and different contexts and conditions in which those patterns of relationships between categories may not exist any longer. You might be focused on understanding something from a cultural perspective, maybe safety culture, customer service culture, um, or some sort of subculture related to identity, race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality. And in that case, you may be thinking about, what are the rituals associated with this cultural category? What are the rites of passage? What are the values and norms and everyday practices? You may be just trying to understand a phenomenon and all of the different types of ways in which it emerges. Are there different types of job stress? What's the kind of typology that we want to develop in terms of explaining job stress in this particular occupational context or this particular operational context? So those are the kinds of frameworks that you might be thinking about as ways that I could group these categories analytically and give them dimension, higher order, lower order, this leads to that, processes, typologies, ways to give dimension and structure to a set of categories where, theory is about identifying relationships between things. And this allows us to not just identify categories, but to build up to theory in terms of identifying relationships between categories. Often we don't find that there is a single pattern. A great example of this is the stages of grief that many of us have heard about. It's my understanding that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who developed this whole concept of the stages of grief, initially thought that there was a linear pattern that people used as they went through these stages, perhaps because there was something about the kind of data that she collected or the analytic strategies that she used to analyze those data. Um, Eventually, there's now a consensus that people don't roll through the stages of grief in the same linear pattern. People may hop around from stage to stage. People may begin with denial and then end up with anger and then go back to being in denial again. And so, there a better way to deal with that may be trying to understand, are there certain types of situations in which a particular linear pattern is more possible, or maybe you just conclude that these are just different stages and people roll through them in different ways. Either way, the point is that you don't want to necessarily try to force a really singular, simple pattern if that's not well represented by your data. Remember, you're trying to develop a scheme of categories that represents the patterns that you're seeing in your data. And so as you move through your data, the patterns that you think you're seeing may change, and you need to be open to changes in those patterns as you move through the data set. So that is an overview of axial coding. In the next presentation, I'll be talking about this process of refining your coding, or what we might call selective coding.